Whenever a senior military or intelligence figure speaks out these days, it's always on the same theme: to warn us of the fast-growing threat of war with our enemies, Putin's Russia chief amongst them. They want the country, its politicians as well as its people, to step up. As the Chief of Defence Staff Sir Richard Knighton put it, we need an all-in mentality. And a major part of that stepping up involves the reserves, our part-time soldiers, seamen and airmen, who will be leaned on heavily if there's a war, and in radically different ways than in the past. So what would they do? Are there enough of them? And if not, what do we do about it? Welcome to the General and the Journalist.
We've got two great guests to chew all that over with us, Elisabeth Braw and Peter Apps, big figures and thinkers in the defence world in their different capacities, and I've had the pleasure of knowing them both for quite a while. Elisabeth Braw is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, focusing on grey zone and hybrid threats, amongst other things. But maybe more relevant to our purposes today, she sits on the UK's National Preparedness Commission. She's also a fellow Scandi. Välkommen till den general och den journalist, Elisabeth.
Tack så mycket, och tack för att du sa mitt förnamn rätt.
Det är kämpebra att det är här. Tack så mycket.
And in case anyone is getting confused what on earth they're talking about, don't worry, we're confused as well. As is Peter, our other guest, and very nice to see you too, Peter.
So Peter Apps is a serving reservist, a role he combines with being a long-standing defence journalist and commentator with Reuters. We've known each other on and off and served together for about 10 years. And he has a new book out, which for those of you who are watching on YouTube can see prominently displayed just over Peter's left shoulder. Give us a pointer, Peter. There it is. And it's directly relevant to our conversation today, and it's called The Next World War. So welcome both.
So let's start, shall we, Patrick? Just you and I redefining what an actual reservist is in people's minds, because obviously they are part-time soldiers, sailors and airmen, but the concept that some people might have who aren't overly familiar with how the military operates today is of Dad's Army, is of a ragtag bunch of amateurs who carry around pitchforks rather than rifles, part-time soldiers, weekend warriors was a phrase that used to be ascribed to them for many years. And that, you'd testify, is a completely outdated and fairly offensive view of what reservists are today.
Yeah, it's a trope that, to be honest, drives me absolutely mad. I mean, the weekend warrior term, it's worth reflecting on. First of all, they're warriors, all of them. And each of those warriors is as liable to serving overseas on operations as any of the regulars are, and indeed took their fair share of casualties and committed themselves to all of the recent campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan and the Balkans and elsewhere. But more to the point, reservists bring something, not just their commitment, and of course, as Peter will tell us, that the difficulty in balancing your work life, your soldiering life and your family life is something that regulars don't have to do, but they bring a mindset, they bring skills from civilian life that regular soldiers don't have. So they are fully professional, an absolutely vital component of the armed forces, particularly the army, and I couldn't do what they do. I mean, I'm absolutely bowled over by them. They're highly professional, really committed, and they're great people. And I mean, Tom, you've spent most of your professional career deeply interested in defence and on military operations and campaigns. You're quite used to putting yourself in harm's way. That's where you and I met in Basra. With all of that background, did you not think of joining the reserves?
I didn't. Actually, I did think about joining the regulars just after sort of university. I didn't do that either because I thought I'd become a pesky, annoying journalist instead. And I think for two reasons. One, journalists kind of like to think of themselves as objective and unpartisan and unbiased. And, Peter's a journalist, so I think I was wrong thinking I could serve my country or be a journalist. It was one or the other. But I have to say, there was also that social cachet, if I can put it, and that was before Iraq and Afghanistan certainly redefined the meaning of a reservist to me. And I think you can kind of sum that up by Gareth from The Office. Remember Gareth from The Office?
Don't go there.
So tall, blonde one with a bowl cut who used to brag all the time about how he was in the TA and a lean, mean fighting machine. And he gave reservists a sort of a bad smell about him, sort of gun-nut stroke, pretty rubbish. And I think I'm really embarrassed to say, victim of the Gareth syndrome as well, thinking that's just not really what I want to be associated with. Out of interest, I mean, you were in the army, so did Gareth damage recruiting to the reserves, that whole image?
I don't think it damaged recruiting, but it damaged the perception. And there's still people, I mean, you've just done it, that quote that. I mean, it's worth saying that Gareth from the office wouldn't get into the reserves today.
There we go. And that is Gareth told.
There we go. Yeah. Anyway, so let's talk about reserves. So part-time voluntary soldiers on these islands are actually much older than a standing professional army. I mean, they go all the way back to Saxon times. So we've had Saxon militias, we've had yeomanry, we've had rifle volunteers, Haldane's territorial army, and of course they played a huge role during the Cold War. So Elizabeth, I want to start with you. You really got the bit between your teeth on the urgent need for more reservists. You've written a recent column in the Times, you've written extensively, you talk about this. Why have reserves shot up the priority league, and why this sudden recognition that they're needed so much?
In the UK and elsewhere, people realise that more people need to be involved in the defence of the country. And I think where they realise we need reserves or reservists is that the armed forces, the full-time armed forces, are very good at what they do. But then there are other things that they can't attend to all the time and really shouldn't be asked to do at all, but have ended up doing because there's nobody else. And now that we have these new forms of aggression against our countries, that is an obvious area where reserves who hopefully know their home areas well, who go to work somewhere and are available to help, where they could play a totally unique role. By the way, that is already happening in Norway and in a few other countries. It could happen here too, but I think what people have realized is that yes, the British Army and the other services are excellent for the sort of intense warfare that they specialize in, but then there is everything else. Who is going to do it?
Mm. The obvious thing to say is that it was the invasion of Ukraine that really catalyzed this, and that sudden realization that you can't outsource national security and defense to a series of small professional institutions. It's a whole of nation effort, it's a whole of society effort. Do you think that this was on people's agenda across Europe before the Ukraine war, or has it been Ukraine that really kicked it off?
In some countries, it was on the agenda before Ukraine, but Ukraine was obviously the fork in the road, the milestone, whatever you want to call it. And we have seen in a number of countries that have voluntary reserves that applications shot up. In Sweden, they shot up. Applications to the Home Guard, which is voluntary, shot up by 600%, more than 600% in 2022. Extraordinary figures because people want to help. And I think that is something that we have to consider in the UK as well. There's often this sort of dismissive attitude towards so-called ordinary citizens in the UK. The idea is that they wouldn't want to help and they're disengaged. I don't think they are. They just haven't been asked to contribute or invited to contribute in any sort of way that is accessible to them.
Elizabeth, I was really struck by your point in the Times you wrote about not so long ago. In Sweden, Crown Princess Victoria, heir to the Swedish throne, in Norway, Princess Ingrid Alexandra, also doing military service. Both of them have signed up to their country's reserves. And that, in a nutshell, kills dead the Gareth from the office thing, doesn't it, about the social cafe if royalty themselves are doing their bit?
Exactly. And by the way, in Norway, Princess Ingrid was doing her military service as a conscript, which is no mean feat because only 15% are admitted. They then go on to the Home Guard, which is a Norwegian reserve for the most part. It's so selective. So it's almost as selective as getting into Oxbridge.
So let's just emphasize that this isn't something that people are compelled to do. This is something that is attractive, that people fight to do. Is that right?
In theory, military service in Norway is mandatory, but because it's so incredibly selective, if you are lucky enough to be selected, then you are the luckiest person in the world. The fewest people turn down that invitation. That's how military service works in Norway. And as a result, the reserve, or the Home Guard, which is the main reserve, and the other part of the reserve are highly qualified and know what they are doing.
But what we're talking about here is one of the roles for reservists, which essentially what you're describing there is territorial defence in the case of Norway, Sweden and Finland. And what you were talking about previously for the UK would be what we would think of as homeland defence, national resilience, part of our Article 3 commitments as a NATO member. So that's sort of key point defence. It's being prepared to respond to attacks on critical national infrastructure. It's all of the sort of homeland stuff. And there was some discussion about this in the SDR, wasn't there?
There was, and there was also in the integrated review back 5 years ago. I recall vividly, because I was part of it, that the integrated review called for a civilian reserve, as they put it, which was then the task was given to a commission of which I was part, and we put forward, I think, an excellent proposal, but there was no political appetite. Not just proposal, plan, but there was no political appetite for it. But there is good news, which is that Sweden has, in the past 12 months or so, not just decided to have a civil reserve or civilian reserve, but also implemented it. It is so impressive. It is 19 professions for which reservists will be selected, are being selected. So everything from electrical repair crews to funeral directors, so that the country will be able to keep operating with these with this civil reserve in 19 professions, so that the society will be able to keep going in case of war.
That's sort of one role. It's national resilience, it's homeland defence. But of course, there are other roles that when we think about reserves, one of them is augmentation of the existing force. And I want to come back to that because Peter is a really good example of that, bringing some specialist skills. But the other one, of course, is reinforcement. And the British Army has no second echelon. All of our regular and reserve forces are effectively committed to needing to deploy in the first echelon to provide NATO's strategic reserve corps. So there's nothing left on the shelf after that's gone out. And that assumes that you can win the first battle. But we very rarely win the first battle. And very often the regular army is decimated in that first battle, and you need to generate a second echelon. So having a second echelon, having something that you can fall back on, is the other function of the reserve. The SDR talks about needing to grow the army, or the reserves rather, by 20%. Is that enough?
Before I answer that question, can I ask you, Patrick, so the strategic reserve, the ex-regulars, if I'm not mistaken, the services, and especially the army, doesn't have, the army doesn't have a way of contacting them, doesn't have their contact or up-to-date contact details. So it seems to me that would be the first echelon that you would activate. But if there's no way of knowing whether you can reach them and whether they will turn up, then why do we even have them? So it's
a very good point. Whether you describe it as the strategic reserve, which is how to refer it at the moment, or the regular reserve, which so this is people who have served formally and are still liable to call up. I am one of them, and indeed my relevance has just been extended by another 5 years, I think, which gave me a bit of a thrill.
But it's a good question for you, though, if you don't mind me ever so gently turning it back to you, Patrick. Why don't you have that list? I mean, you were CGS for a while. You could have issued an order to make one up.
So we started thinking properly about this degree of depth and resilience probably in about 2017, 2018, and we began to think through what it would take to mobilise, to get back to the days of the Cold War, where people would have an annual liability of turning up, passing some basic tests, checking in, checking their kit and so on, and they get paid for it. And we haven't done that for a long time. We've taken our eye off the ball because we lived in this era where warfare was something that was expeditionary and it was discretionary and it wasn't essential. And you could see from about 2017, 2018, arguably earlier actually, that we needed a plan. And it's taking longer than it should to put that in place.
That's very honest of you.
And can I also throw one more question at you, Patrick? And I have it fresh in my head because
Hang on, who's interviewing who here?
That's what happens when you interview. When you invite me, you get to answer questions.
You're absolutely right. And you know what? He could answer a few more questions, really.
So I have this figure in my head because I just finished, as you said, a report for the National Preparedness Commission about reserves. And that figure is, in the Estonian reserves, they try to make reservist life as meaningful as possible for the reserves, even though they don't have a choice. They have to turn up, right? But even so, even if you are obliged to turn up, if the army or any service makes it boring or meaningless, then you're likely to find a way of not turning up, right, and pay the fine. But 95% of Estonian reservists are happy with their commanders. I think that is extraordinary, and I wonder whether similar surveys and results exist in the UK Armed Forces.
I think this is a moment to deftly swerve this question and ask Peter, as a serving reservist.
And it's great because I have an incredibly diplomatic response, which is that there is a huge, if we look at all the places where conflict might break out, both in Eastern Europe and Europe in general and the Pacific, some countries do reserves very, very well, and some countries do reserves very, very badly. The Scandinavians, the Estonians, increasingly the Poles will give anyone they want military training this year, and they'll then be in a reserve where they know where to fight, they know who their commanders are going to be, they know they trust their commanders. All this stuff's really important. A location that does incredibly badly is Taiwan. So in Taiwan, they've had conscript military service for most of the last 70 years. They got rid of it for a bit, so most of them did a bit of range firing, a lot of cleaning stuff, and they came out of it with a significant lack of respect for their chain of command. And even more seriously, because obviously they're worried about Chinese invasion, I could not encounter a single member of the Taiwanese sort of mainstream reserve who knew where they should go in the event of a war. So that's pretty catastrophic. I would say the UK is sort of on a sliding scale to that. We have the strategic reserve, but we don't, for example, have any reliable information on who in it is any good. Who would we want to give the command appointments to in the event of a conflict? We don't know where people live. The rest of the reserve is doing a couple of things quite interestingly, and they're very different. So some of them are doing the same sort of thing they were during the Helmand era. They're training up as, quote unquote, sort of proper mainstream military skills, and they're prepared to drop in. So, a 4-para reservist can be dropped into, who's done all these courses, or a Royal Marine reservist can be dropped into Estonia, or they can be sent up with the Royal Marine Reserve, as Al Khan's was the Minister of the Armed Forces, at short notice. I'm not one of those people, and I'm not one of those people for an incredibly simple reason. Those of you who can see me online have probably already guessed it. The reason that I'm not one of those reserves is that I'm largely paralysed from the shoulders down, because I was a reservist at university, and then I went off to join Reuters as a journalist. I broke my neck covering the Sri Lankan Civil War. So by the time I was 25, 26, I was paralysed from the shoulders down, and I was assuming that I was not going to be coming back into uniform. And after Crimea, I got a tap on the shoulder from the British Army when General Nick Carter was CGS and Patrick was Model Field Army, saying we're standing up a bunch of specialist capabilities, and there was stuff that I could talk about use of narrative, emerging forms of warfare, politics, the frontline experience I had in Sri Lanka, the interplay of media and kind of civil affairs that was useful enough to come back in. So I came back in to deliver that specialist stuff, and there were lots of people doing different types of specialist. Chief of Defence Staff was talking about intelligence specialists at RAF Whitton. So they do stuff that no one else can do, and sometimes during a crisis they will come in to do that full time. But neither of those two things answers the question of what we do if a big war breaks out and we have to call up that second or third echelon, because as Patrick has pointed out, at the moment everyone who can fight goes out the door on day 1 or maybe day 5, certainly day 30, and we then have to rebuild a force, and we are not very well in a position as of tonight to do that. I would argue we need to look at the SDR, go, the situation has changed, we need to be a lot better at that by 2029. And that brings me to the last and most awkward point, which is that getting people into the reserve in the UK is unbelievably slow. So if someone right now wants to join the reserve, their paperwork will probably take half a year, if not longer, to go through. And that is deadly when it comes to getting people into the system. And it also risks being deadly to their respect for that chain of command, the people who will command them and give them orders of life and death in the event of a crisis. So lots of stuff that's good, lots of stuff that's bad, and lots of stuff that I think we are probably on the clock for now.
And your point about specialisms, you're a journalist, but you're a specialist analyst, and you have real specialist skills, which in the modern day of age, when you inject AI, robotics, and the modern world that we live in, especially the modern warfare that we fight, the sort of people most valuable, for example, on the Ukrainian front line, are drone operators. First-person view, FPV, drone operators. And quite frankly, the best at doing that are kids who've spent the last 5 years on Xbox and are just utterly talented at operating a console, which quite frankly, me as someone in my early 50s and Patrick, someone in his later 50s, would be less adept at. And we're not even going to go anywhere near Elizabeth's qualifications for that.
Just a quick point to that. When I came in 2016 for the first time, I wasn't talking about any of that at all. The stuff, the reason I was useful is because while Patrick and everyone else had their very specific experiences in Helmand, when I was in Sri Lanka in the Civil War, I had very different frontline experiences, including getting an idea of that interplay between what's on the news, what happens on the battlefield, interplay of aid agencies, interplay of religious leaders, stuff that was frankly too dangerous to do well in Helmand. And that, when it came to training up people who were going into harm's way, was incredibly useful. So the fact that I had not been a soldier in battle, but I had been in a war, and I picked up some useful lessons there, was one of the specialist skills that I came in with.
I was chatting to someone when we were in Kyiv, Tom, who is responsible for one of the larger drone formations, and he said that they could never have achieved what they have with drones had they used professional military forces, because their minds were prisoners of their experience, of their doctrine, and they didn't bring the sort of disruptive thinking that civilians can do. And this guy went on to say that actually, when you think about autonomous warfare, algorithmic warfare, and drones, you actually need civilian mindsets, not just with the technical expertise, but actually the sort of enterprise culture to create a different way of fighting. Now, that to me felt quite insulting. I mean, I like to think that we are reasonably adaptive as professional military forces, but I had to admit that there was something behind it, something to what he said. I mean, Peter, does that echo ring a bell with you?
Yeah, no, I mean, hugely. I mean, without going into huge degrees of specifics on experience, there have been moments, particularly when I came back, where you felt you were in a team with a properly wartime ethos. So you had people who'd spent, in that era, most people had done a Hellman tour that had been pretty punchy. So you had people who really understood the sharp end of warfare. Then you had your techies who were coming in. They maybe don't understand what I understand. They certainly don't understand how a battle group operates. And you start building a proper sort of team of teams. And the key thing there is respect for each other's experiences and the ability to militarize those up to a point. So, for example, one of the things I had to learn is, how do you make sure your people get paid? Because the army has a system for that. And if you don't do it properly, reservists won't get paid. The constant issue for people in the reserves is making sure that the stuff goes through the system. The moments when it's worked, immediately after Ukraine 2014, 15, 16, beginning of COVID, Ukraine 2022, that's where change becomes possible. And I think this year the mood has changed in the UK. It changed in Scandinavia a long time ago. But if you look at the polls, Times did some really good polling, 25% of people in the population saying defence is the top priority, higher than any of the other things.
Elizabeth, on Peter's point about specifics, what it is you could do, if someone's sitting at home listening to this right now, for example, thinking, well, I wouldn't mind being a reservist and signing up and doing my bit, but I don't really think I've got the skills. I can't run 20 miles with a rucksack and a rifle over my back. What would you say to them?
Well, I would say if you are lucky enough to live in a country where there is a civil reserve, there is one, you are in luck. But I would also say things are changing very quickly in this country, including with what has just been discussed, the recognition that yes, physical ability is one thing, but the fact, for example, that the MOD, the Ministry of Defense, has just extended the liability for ex-regulars to 65 years means that Patrick gets to serve even longer.
I'm so pleased.
But it's also a reflection of the recognition that you can help in ways that maybe when you're not at your physical peak, whether that is because you happen to be older than 55 or maybe not as fit as regular soldiers. So there is a recognition everybody can help. And I think there's also recognition that people want to help. The sort of cynicism that we have had for a long time in the UK, that people, they wouldn't want to help, they're not interested. I think that is fading a bit.
They won't want me.
Exactly.
And Peter, how do you marry that with your day job? How much time does it take, for example?
There are fundamentally two paths into the reserves. You're either fit enough to deploy alongside the regular force, or you have a skill set that's good enough to be able to find a place in one of our variety of specialist units. There is currently not really another way, aside from joining the cadet forces as an instructor, which is a very valuable way of doing stuff, but is, of course, very different. I think, again, that's sort of where the Scandinavians, and indeed the UK during the war, rethought that, if you're non-deployable, you can still do a job in an office and free up someone for the front line. So I think we need to get a bit a bit more forward-leaning on those kind of models, because, yes, I mean, I get people emailed saying, how do we become a reservist? And often the answer is there isn't an easy way, and that yields frustration, or it's not an easy way and it'll take a long time. And I think we need to find a way of moving past that
Peter, what do you personally get out of it? Why do you do it?
Someone asked me this the other day. So I joined the Army Reserve at university, and I joined Voyages because I wanted adventures, because I was a 18, 19, 21-year-old person. I broke my neck doing that. I knew that I wasn't going to get to run a frontline bureau like Kabul or Nairobi. I found reporting interesting. I found that removal from that community that you get in the military, or for that matter in a frontline bureau, someone like Reuters is very, very tight-knit forward teams. And I loved it. It was the same. It was 10 years after the injury. My eldest niece had just been born, so I felt I was doing something to protect it. And I felt it was really important to be established that someone like me, someone who'd taken up a lot of state resources, could give something back. And some years I've worked full-time, so essentially I've done a desk job during a couple of years. Sometimes I've done just 20 days. Sometimes I've done in the middle. And it's been amazing. I mean, the people are great. The systems are mixed, but at the best, you're dealing with incredibly good people doing important stuff very well. And I push slightly back against that Dad's Army thing. If you look at Dad's Army, it's about people giving back to their society, enjoying it, that sense of being alive. I think that is part of the narrative we're selling, that actually you could be part of doing something important. Owen Mulligan, who just wrote a book called The Accidental Soldier about being a reservist troop commander in Basra, says joining the army is like joining a sitcom, and he's not totally wrong. But actually, if you look at the reason why people have enjoyed it, the things they talk about, either when they're serving or otherwise, that is part of the pleasure, as well as one of the reasons why everyone gets a bit irritated from time to time.
Yeah. We all agree we need more. I think why is pretty self-evident there. We could have a war coming, and we're negligently underprepared for that and underarmed. I guess the killer question is how. And just a quick comparative to introducing us to widen our scope out to the rest of the world. The size of other nations' reserves, and they absolutely contrast quite spectacularly depending where you are in the world. So a couple of examples. Vietnam has 5 million reserves, which is part of their quite long-standing People's War defence model. South Korea also 3 million. Of course, they've got a very imminent threat from North Korea and have done for many, many years. But even the United States, 800,000 reserves and Air National Guards and the like are often deployed. And then you get to Europe, and certainly Western Europe, and those numbers really fall off the cliff. So we discussed us around 30,000 or below at the moment. France around 40,000, or they want to grow a bit more. Germany around 30,000, although they have plans to get up to 200,000 reserves. Finland, I guess, and the Nordics are the outliers. Finland has almost 1 million reserves as well. But if you look at Western European countries like Britain, we are desperately under-ambitious, even on where we want to grow to, aren't we, Elizabeth, to face the current state of the challenge?
Yes, and I wonder why that is. The first step is clearly bureaucracy. How do you expand an organization, and also what is it you want the reserves to do? And that has been, I think, the fundamental question in UK for years now. What is it the UK? Well, UK policymakers and UK society want the reserves to be able to do. And if you don't answer that question, then why would you need to grow the reserves? And then you need to help people realize that they could serve, not somebody else's son or daughter, but they themselves. Crown Princess Victoria started her officer training at age 46. So even though you haven't quite turned 46 yet, Tom, there is
I'm a bit 52.
Good challenge. Good challenge.
So, a 52-year-old has a role to play. That's the point.
Exactly. And even up to 65. So the point is to help people realize that they can play a role. Then, of course, the role for the MOD is to make all that the systems happen, including that database that allows the armed forces to see who is part of the reserve and what their roles are, where they live, how they can be contacted when needed, and so forth.
And of course, in an ideal world, we'd have a standing regular force that was the size we needed it. But of course, that's unbelievably expensive, and we can't afford it. So reserves are a very economic way of maintaining a core structure, some talent, some skill sets that can both augment the current force with the sort of specialist skills that Peter's demonstrated, to provide homeland defence in the way that you were talking about, Elizabeth, and then to provide the second echelon, or the capacity to grow a second echelon at the pace of relevance. Because if you think that growing an army and making it an effective force is something that happens quickly, you're wrong.
So
yeah, and just to ride on that, growing that second echelon is a huge part of deterring an attack on Europe, particularly if the Americans are doing less.
Yeah.
You have to have that population you can mobilize. The Germans realize that, the Poles realize that. We have to work out how we approach it.
So the question is how, and Patrick, you're right, there isn't much money to throw around, ever less these days, obviously. But there is one way of doing it, that's by inducement, tax breaks or whatever you might be, paying more, because you get paid if you're in the reserves. We should make that point, albeit not that much. Which brings us to a question from a listener, Mark, who's emailed in and asked us this. One for you to address if you can, Peter, because Patrick's had too many questions battered his way by Elizabeth brilliantly already. In Australia, you get tax-free earnings if you join the reserve forces, writes Mark. Should the UK take on a similar approach? On top of this, what else could the government do to incentivise the growth of a reserve force?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're really onto something there. So, for example, if we decided we needed to train 30,000 volunteers next year or 20,000 volunteers, I would say they could all drop a tax bracket for the following year. You're not just going after teenagers, you're going after a bunch of people. If people were prepared to do 10 years in the reserve, then maybe a slightly cheaper mortgage. These are already the people who are giving stuff back, so you're not taking that much risk. And the third part of it is that you've got to be really clear, and this is where the language gets blurred. This is about keeping Britain safe, deterring a war, and making sure that your children will not be conscripted into a war we cannot control. And that is why, particularly someone like me, you've just had, maybe 35, like I came back, you've got a couple of nieces or some kids. Actually, it's your time to do 1 year or 10 years doing a bit of part-time service, and that is part of what being in a society is about. And it's about building that individual resilience, which can start in the cadet force, but we can't conscript ex-cadets because no one will let their children join. So you have to have a system where you say, everyone plays their part. And the Scandinavians do this brilliantly, and we traditionally have not done so quite so well.
I worry about spending money to get the wrong kind of people. If you're joining up to be a reservist because you think you're going to get some money off your income tax, you're kind of doing it for the wrong reason, aren't you, Patrick? I mean, when you were in uniform, that's precisely the wrong reason you want anyone to sign up. It's about motivating them, their inner selves and their will, isn't it?
So I think we're kidding ourselves if you think that everybody joins the army for sort of perfectly pure, holier than thou reasons. A lot of people join. Some people do. Some people join through a sense of duty, service, nationalism, patriotism, and the adventure. But some because they haven't got a choice. A lot of other avenues in life have closed down to them. The point is what happens to you once you come in to the armed forces, and the way that the armed forces, that serving as part of a team gives you a set of skills, inculcates a set of values which transform you and transform your employment prospects. I mean, I have yet to meet a serving soldier who hasn't been better off, who doesn't come out better equipped, and isn't better able to make a contribution to society. And it's fun.
Just to echo that, I mean, it was a formative experience as being a cadet. It was a formative experience being a university officer cadet. The moment where you first take charge of other recruits, which often happens really early for people, and people love that, particularly if they're well led, particularly if they're doing something important. So it meets a very, very fundamental human need.
So I think you've just jogged a perfect way to bring this to a close, Peter. So we're going to play a little game here, and we're going to ask each of you to make a no more than 30-second elevator pitch for what you would say to get someone to sign up as a reservist. And because Tom's sitting to my right and he's seen this, Tom, you go first.
Oh, God, I didn't know I had to do this. But the peace-loving, pathetic journalist who's never done anything for his country. I guess it's that. It is literally that. You've got something to tell your children one day. I did my bit. I didn't watch others do it. I didn't regret, maybe I should have done that. I shouldn't have done that. I did my bit, and I stood up when the country needed me to, at a time where life is beginning to get quite dangerous for us.
You just brought a tear to my eye, Tom.
Rubbish.
Very good.
You don't need to be cynical about my patriotism and self-hatred, Patrick.
That's great. Peter, how about you?
It'll be rewarding both professionally, emotionally, and financially. It will be the thing you talk about decades later. And if we get this right, there will not be a major war, and your children, nieces, grandchildren, or whatever, get to grow up as generation did during the Cold War in a world that is on the brink but does not go over the edge.
Nicely done. Elizabeth?
You've read watched all the news about what's happening in the world, in Ukraine, in the UK, and and you've felt powerless, but if you join the reserves, you have agency. You can be part of helping the UK keep these threats at bay, keep conflict at bay, and you'll meet new people. And that is not insignificant, considering that in the UK, just as in every Western country, loneliness, social fragmentation is growing. The reserves are where you can meet new people of all ages, of all backgrounds.
Look, the three of us have set a brilliantly high bar now for Patrick to have to go last and beat the lot of us. Go on then, General.
I'm not sure I can top all of those, but I think it's a combination of all of those things. And in the 40 years that I've been serving as a soldier, all 40 of those have been with reservists. And some of the most professional, dedicated, and inspiring soldiers that I've served with have been people who do that part-time. And whether they are a carpenter or a plumber or a titan of industry, serving in Iraq in Basra in 2007, they are remarkable people. And if I'm going to make a specific plug, join up, and in particular, join the Honourable Artillery Company, which I was happy enough, delighted, honoured to be Colonel Commandant of, and the Rifles, because you won't find two finer units and with an extraordinary distinguished operational record.
Okay, with that a personal plug there from Patrick, we must wrap. Peter Apps and Liz Braw, thank you both so much for spending your time with us today. We're really grateful, and your wisdom is hugely appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And you know what? We hope the Prime Minister was listening, because we've kind of done his job for him there. We've done what he should be doing right now, which of course begs the question, which Prime Minister? And will it be the same one when this episode goes out?
Suppress those journalistic instincts.
That is another question for a different podcast altogether. There's a very good one, actually, called The State of It. Our political colleagues just down the road. You can get a bit of that there right about now. That is it, though, for this week. Shout out, as ever, for your emails. We read them. We appreciate them all. They're hugely useful. The email address is generalandjournalist@thetimes.co.uk, generalandjournalist@thetimes.co.uk. Until next week. Bye, Patrick.
Bye, Tom.